Alrighty guys, it's Monday morning. I'm currently waiting for the UPS guy to show up with some new lower valve spring locators so I can get my heads back together. But in the meantime, I've been working on this little 4.8. Remember, we're in the middle of a shootout. Small block versus big block, 4.8 versus 8.1. Dollar per dollar, naturally aspirated against naturally aspirated. But the other thing I probably need to add into the mix is a horsepower per cubic inch comparison, because I can almost guarantee you that little 4.8 is going to make way more power per cubic inch than the 8.1, because, well, that's just the way that it's probably going to work out. In the meantime, while I'm waiting for the locators to show up, I've been working on the engine, and there's a few things I had to take care of. One of them, a lot of you guys pointed this out, it was my bad. I should have checked it the first time, and that is the oil pump clearance on the inside of the pump. I just slapped it on the first time. I didn't think nothing of it, but I knew in the back of my mind, yeah, I probably should check it, but I was like, it'll be fine. But then honestly, a lot of you guys commented, rightfully so, that I should have checked the clearance on the pump. And since I hadn't even torqued the balancer bolt all the way down yet, the front cover was just on, it would take me like 2 minutes to pull it back apart and check it. And I did. I'm glad I did. I don't think it would have been a huge issue, but here's the deal with the oil pump. Basically, I've got the cover off of it still right now, but there's an aluminum body of the pump with 2 hardened steel gears on the inside. And the tolerances between the pump gear and the body of the pump are very, very tight. And because the mounting holes right here are a little bit larger than the bolt, the body of the pump can actually move around just a little bit. And if it's in the wrong spot, well, the pump gear can kind of jam up against the body of the pump. And you don't want that, because that could wear in there prematurely and you could lose oil pressure potentially. So all you got to do is take a couple of feeler gauges I took the 2 smallest ones out of my set. There is a 15 10,000ths right there, or 1.5 thousandths, and there's a 2 thousandths. I took those each and just kind of laid them in here. I probably can't do it now because these things are like so ridiculously thin, but more or less come on, get in there. I'll just kind of stick it in there so you can see that we've got clearance now. But basically, I just took one of them, laid it in there the long way on the top, and did the same thing on the bottom. And then, with the bolts loose, and then once I had the feeler gauges on top and bottom, tightened everything down. That way it should be nice and centered. And now, as you can see, we've got at least that 15 10,000ths of clearance around all of the edges of the pump. Now, these feeler gauges, they're like paper thin, or even a little bit thinner than that. So you got to be careful with working these things, but we get the pump centered up now. I torqued the bolts back down, retorqued the bottom pickup tube there. This is a new oil pump, by the way. It's a Summit. I think it's a 10295 is the part number, which is a Melling part number. So it's probably a Melling pump, but it's a little bit less because it's like Summit's brand. The old oil pump wasn't necessarily bad, but I figured we're in here, why not just kind of freshen everything up? I know with age, sometimes these trucks can lose a little bit of oil pressure. A lot of times the culprit is actually the pickup tube O-ring right in between here and here, but we get a new pump and obviously a new O-ring to go along with it. So we should have no oil pressure issues at all on this 4.8, and then it'll have no leaks as well because we've sealed everything up. Now that I have the pump done, all I got to do is put the cover on, and then I can put the oil pan back on as well, because I also took some time to weld in a -10 drain, just because I'm thinking eventually perhaps we will have a turbo on this setup. And I did something a little different when I welded this one in, and it worked out way better than when I welded the turbo drain on my 8.1. Basically what I did, I just took my little blue butane torch or whatever it's called, preheated the aluminum, cleaned it first obviously with just some my little Scotch-Brite sander thing, which I did that on the last one. But normally whenever I've welded a cast aluminum oil pan that's been used, I get really poor results because there's so much oil and dirt and grease that's like embedded into the aluminum. But this time by preheating it, I think maybe it kind of cooked off a lot of that oil, and it made for a little bit cleaner weld, because I didn't change the setup of the welder. I think I was on 150 amps, 60% DC EN, so it gets a little bit more cleaning. Normally my welder defaults like 65%, and then I think I was at 90 hertz, which is about the same setup that I normally run. It is a inverter machine. But anyway, just by preheating it and kind of cooking off a little bit of that oil residue, I got a much cleaner result. And the only thing I wish I would have done differently now is because I welded it from the inside. I was originally planning on welding it from the outside, so I kind of left it down a little bit so I'd have enough room to get the torch on the outside here. But I did weld it on the inside because it looks nicer from the outside. but I just wish I would have raised it up a little bit. We are above the oil level. I kind of held the dipstick in here, and I believe when it's full with the engine off, the oil level is kind of right about here, which is just a hair below this drain. But the little transmission cooler lines that sit right down here, the oil drain is going to be kind of close to those. I don't think it'll interfere, but if you're going to do this, maybe learn from what I did and try to raise that up just a little bit higher, and then you'll have plenty of room. In terms of front to back positioning, we are just a little bit behind the second mounting hole on the passenger side here, and I did leave just enough room to get a wrench up in here. That's another thing to keep in mind, especially if you're going to be welding a drain into an oil pan. So yeah, basically where we're at now, I'm going to throw the little, it's, I don't know, second windage tray, whatever you want to call it. I'll throw that back in here. I'll tighten this guy up because that's just finger tight for now. Front cover, well, obviously we can't forget the oil pump cover. Front cover back on, then I'll flip the engine over. We'll get the pan on, and then we'll see if we get those little valve keepers yet, because that'll be the next thing that we're waiting on. All right, so I've got the short block complete and we're ready to move on to the top end. I figured it'd be worth mentioning just a few things about lining up the covers on these LSs, because it is somewhat critical to make sure the oil pan especially is lined up, because the transmission actually bolts to both the engine and the oil pan, and they've got to be in the same exact plane. Otherwise it might have some stresses and cause something to crack. Here we have the lower oil pan. As you can see, this is a machine flat surface right here. It has to be coplanar with this bell housing surface right here, and there's two bolts, one and one, that the lower part of the transmission bolt to. So basically all I do is I just take like a flat piece of aluminum, kind of line it up down there, make sure I'm on the flat spots, and then just take a few bolts, kind of slightly snug, take a rubber hammer, just kind of tap it back and forth to make sure the oil pan is lined up. And I do the same thing with the front and rear covers. You want it to be centered on the seal, but you also want the bottom edge of this to be centered or on the same plane as the bottom edge of the oil pan rail for both the rear cover and the front cover. That way nothing's like twisted or tweaked. Oil drain's looking good in there. And now we are ready to move on to the cylinder heads. I will mention I do have the degree wheel on there just because I am going to check piston to valve clearance once we get the heads on. So we have the lower ID locators. They just showed up, and I'll kind of show you the difference between the two. This is the one that came with a comp kit. This had the 570 ID, as you can see, pretty loose. This one has the 510 ID. It has a nice tight fit in there, so the valves will be kept, or the valve springs will be kept exactly where they need to be. If you're curious, this is the part number for the lower locator. That's the correct one, the 510 ID, and they say it's for a 500 guide. These are the upper locks, part number right there. This is the part number for the upper retainer, and the valve springs, of course, the 918-16, meaning it's a set of 16. And then the seals, oh, right here, I cut the part number off. Oh, there it is. 511-16, that is the valve seal. So that's everything we need to put the valve train together. I do have some checking springs I'll put on cylinder number 1 just to kind of make sure that we have adequate clearance, which I don't think that we will have a problem with that. But just something that's worth checking while we're going through the effort. So let's continue on. All right, so I've got all the valve springs swapped out, new seals and everything. I checked the valve guides, everything's real tight. And I even took most of the valves out and I put them in my drill just to kind of take some Scotch-Brite and clean off any of that carbon that's built up on the back side of the intake valves, you know, just from the PCV and the oil mist that's in the intake system. But we've got everything ready to go, and I even have a set of checking springs that are installed on the number 1 cylinder that's on the driver's side of the engine. Now, a checking spring is basically just a slightly weaker style valve spring, not meant to be run in the engine, but it lets you just open and close the valves manually to check clearance with a dial indicator. And we have the degree wheel on the engine. We will check the, let's see, I'm pretty sure it's the exhaust valve at 10 degrees before top dead center, because the piston on split overlap, because the piston is coming up to push the exhaust out and the exhaust valve is just kind of closing, but there's a spot about 10 degrees where they'll be fairly close. And then 10 degrees after top dead center where the intake valve just starts to open up so the piston can draw in, you know, the new fresh charge of air and fuel. So degree wheel is in place. We have the checking springs on, and we'll just kind of slap this together temporarily with the head gasket in there. We won't torque it down, but we'll just kind of snug it up. Speaking of head gaskets, these are a specific gasket for converting a 99 and 2000 4.8 or 5.3 from a composite head gasket to MLS. And the reason it's different is because this little raised seal right here, normally the later model ones go straight across, where this year has that little bump in there. Apparently some cylinder heads had a little pocket that was milled out here and here, just 2 of them. These heads don't have it, but if your heads do have that pocket milled out and you want to run MLS head gaskets, you will have to run this specific gasket on a 4.8 or a 5.3. And Mala also makes a similar gasket for a 6.0, because I think the same thing was true for 99 and 2000 6.0s. If you do not have the pocket, like my heads do not, we still should be fine to run the gasket, because there's no, I mean, it's just a big flat area through here. So it doesn't matter if the seal goes across here or it kind of pops up in. But if you do have that pocket, you absolutely must have this gasket. So this is the part number for the MLS head gasket. Remember, this is 4.8 and 5.3. We're using some ARP head bolts, not studs, but just the bolts. That's the part number I'm using right there. And this part number is specific for the early model LSs as well, because there's 4 shorter bolts and the rest are long. And the short ones, they go in the top corners here and, well, that one right there. So the later model ones, I believe, had all the long bolts. The stock hardware is torque to yield. You shouldn't reuse it. I know some people do, but you shouldn't. So either buy new factory bolts, they're not that expensive, or if you want to hold a little bit more power, it's probably a good idea to step up to something a little bit stronger like an ARP head bolt. All right, so I checked both the intake and the exhaust valve probably 3 or 4 times, just because everything wasn't making sense in terms of where the lift numbers, where the clearance numbers compared against the rotation of the engine. But I realized toward the end of it, my degree wheel was just slid off a couple of degrees in one direction. So not a huge deal when you're doing this. The critical thing to measure is how much space you have between the valve and the piston. And as long as you check a wide range, I mean, they say about 10 degrees, 10 degrees before top dead center for the exhaust and 10 degrees after top dead center for the intake valve. That's your closest points, but I checked everything all the way from 0 degrees, true top dead center, all the way to 20 degrees in both directions, checking both valves. I think bare minimum, you're supposed to have about 80 to 100 thou on the intake, 100 to 120 thou on the exhaust, which is still on the tight side, but we have way more than that. We have like 250 on the intake and 230 on the exhaust. So tons of room, not a worry in the world about anything hitting, which I guess I didn't really think that we would, but it's just, once more, peace of mind when you're assembling an engine. If this were a racier style build with a really, really large cam with a really tight overlap, then we'd probably get a lot closer than that. But we got a relatively wider lobe separation angle. So no worries at all. Let's get this head back off the engine. We'll pull the checking springs out, swap the final 2 beehive springs in, and get this long block put together for good. So if you guys will remember, I'm kind of calling this like a budget build. Not that I'm not trying to spend a lot of money, but I am trying to match how much I spent on this compared to what I did with the 8.1. Although ultimately we have spent probably $800 or $900 more than what that swap cost. But I've always been of the mindset that you should do something once and do it as right as you possibly can. That way you don't have to redo stuff later on. And where we have the short block now, it's just about complete. But once it goes in the truck, it won't have to come back out again because we have a good cam that's going to work now while we're naturally aspirated, but also if we do some sort of forced induction. We have enough ring gap to work with boost. I have a drain in the oil pan if I ever decide to go with a turbocharger. We have basically an engine that's set up and ready to rock and roll, all new gaskets, nothing is going to leak. We've got a new oil pump in there. So this should be good to go for many, many miles to come. And the only reason it should ever have to come back out is if we put way too much boost on top of it and send a rod out at the side of the block. If we do decide to make some more changes to our naturally aspirated build, well, that's super easy. I can unbolt the heads, I can change the intake out while everything is under the hood of the truck. So here's kind of what she looks like. I went ahead and I mocked up the Texas Speed long tubes just because you got to while it's on the stand here. I am going to paint the block just semi-gloss black and leave all the aluminum color that it is right now. I kind of like how that looks. The valve train is not in because I am waiting on, or actually like literally just received this morning, a BTR roller trunnion upgrade kit. So I'll throw this in probably next time. This has a different pivot in the center that works for a higher lift camshaft, and it has these little roller bearings for the pivot. So that'll work good with the increased RPM that we're going to be turning and with the increased spring pressure of the new valve springs. So that's pretty much a wrap on the long block. Like I said, we get a few more things to put in, and I am going to do a little bit of work under the hood of the truck as well. Nothing crazy, but I am going to paint some of that slightly rusted metal. I mean, I live out in the desert, so it's not like it's ever going to rust through, but we'll just make it look a little nicer. Although the only hesitation I have about doing that is like once, say if I have the front half of the frame or even the front insides of the frame painted up, then I'm going to want to blow the whole thing apart and paint the entire frame, which I'll probably do in stages because at some point I'm going to rebuild the whole front suspension. Oh, I've had these for a while. I haven't mentioned to you guys, I do have some atomic fab coilovers up front. So eventually I'll be doing that. I did also get the coilovers out back. So I'll have the bed off, we'll change the suspension. I'm just trying to say at some point we eventually will have this truck torn apart enough where I can paint most of the frame. Let's see, we've got the wider radiator to go in, electric fans, that'll help free up some horsepower just because we're not turning the clutch fan. The torque converter, that'll not necessarily produce more horsepower from the engine, but it has a different torque multiplication ratio, which will kind of show up in terms of a little bit more power. So all those things to look forward to. We're going to build a custom exhaust. I'll show you the wiring for the fan. I always show you guys every single step along the way, and power doing weird stuff. And hopefully you guys find this somewhat entertaining or at least informative. I do have to say thank you for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you. We have had a bunch of new viewers recently coming by to check out the 4.8 versus 8.1 build off. So if you are new, thanks for stopping by. I appreciate it. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Drop a comment down below, and finally, please click that like button if you enjoyed the content, because all those things help this channel in the algorithm. I will see you guys next time. I have no idea what we're going to be doing, but it's going to be on probably this truck. See you guys.